And we're going to look at how ADHD develops. It starts off with what we call non-verbal thinking. I mentioned earlier it's a more efficient thinking. Now, there are essentially two forms of thinking. There's verbal, like talking to yourself in your head, and there is visual or kinesthetic. We could just simply call that non-verbal thinking. And if you see the picture here, then the boy is thinking about a wizard, and the girl is also thinking about wizard, but one with words, the other one with meaning of the word. And we all start out life as non-verbal thinkers. Before we learn to speak, words don't feature in our thinking. And I'm sure you've heard the old adage, a picture speaks 1,000 words. So what it means is that non-verbal thinking can process more information and faster than verbal thinking. We need to slow down our thinking to the speed of speech in order to think with words. And this is one of the key reasons why we talk about the gift of dyslexia, or the gift of neurodiversity, because they retain that non-verbal thinking, which is so more efficient. Albert Einstein, for example, said that the words of the language as they are written or spoken don't play any part in my mechanism of thought. What he was saying is that he was a non-verbal thinker. Now, focusing is a key element here. We've talked about focusing before, and external focus, taking in data through our senses, is critical for accurate perception. When we are focused, when we are present, we call it being orientated. We are taking in reality as it really is. When we are the opposite, we call it disorientation. We could call it internally focused in our mind. Our senses will be distorted. You remember the labels, visual processing disorder. This disorder is caused by disorientation, where the data from our senses is distorted in our process. And the interesting thing here is that while orientation or focus is critical for accurate perception, disorientation, which is losing focus, you could say, is critical for high-speed processing, because we're using this non-verbal thinking mode. So as you can see, orientation is good for perceiving reality. Disorientation is very good for imagination, creativity, problem solving, and so on. More efficient for that. The bubble is a word that a lot of parents of ADHD people recognize. It's when the child or the ADD person is kind of lost in their own thought. Daydreaming, we could call it as well. It's used for entertainment, as in daydreaming, but it's also used for problem solving. Whenever we are confused, a nonverbal thinker is confused, they will engage kind of scenarios in their mind. They will engage their creative problem solving imagination, and they will be completely absorbed in their thought. They will go into their bubble. And anything that they can take with them into that bubble, that could be Lego bricks for a kid, or a tablet, iPad, computer games, or maybe a Barbie, or playing with dolls. They can be completely absorbed in their own world, and they are likely not to notice anything else around them. And this is hyperfocus, but it's also disorientation. Here is a young boy, a wonderful Indian movie that is about a dyslexic boy, and called Stars on Earth. And this is a wonderful example of how disorientation is engaged when someone is confused, and how someone tries to use disorientation to get out of his confusion as in problem solving. And you can see here his confusion. This is the dyslexic boy in the film. And you can also start to see how his disorientation starts to kick in, and his imagination distorts his perception, and he's off into his imaginary world. Now you can see in this depiction of his imagination that he likes astronomy, and you can see how much data he has about the solar system, for example, which planet is where, which number it is. Even the fact that Pluto is not necessarily a real planet.
Akhirnya itu boleh jalan Dunia itu try. Planet ini dunia. Kita akan di sana dua dunia. 3, 2, 1, 3. Timer.
And of course, a math test. A math test is likely to take about half an hour, and in that time he managed to answer one question and he got it wrong. So, and he's not even aware of having got it wrong. So this is a very funny example of that. I recommend this film for anyone who wants to really understand dyslexia. Self is an important concept here. It's important to recognize how a sense of self is not necessarily fully formed in an ADHD person, because self is really about separation and boundaries. There's me and there's you. I am different from you, and everybody else is different from another person. So in the real world, there's very clear separation and boundaries between one person and another. In the imagination, that's not necessarily true. I can well imagine being you or being anyone in anyone I like. I don't even have to imagine being another human. I can imagine being an animal or a planet. So there is no kind of defined self in our imagination necessarily. And that's why this concept often is not fully formed for an ADHD person. Change is another concept, a real-life concept. Change is governed by the rules of physics in the real world, but in our imagination, change is not governed by the rules of physics. Anything can happen. In the real world, we can kind of expect what happens, and change, in fact, is always happening in the real world. But in the imagination, any change that happens, we are in control of that. But in the real world, there's a lot of change that happens that we're not in control of. Consequence is another concept, which in the real world is, we tend to learn that concept through experience. In the real world, the concept of consequence is constant and predictable. But in the imagination, that's not necessarily true. And here's a little video that shows how we tend to learn about consequence. We burn ourselves. And now we know that that's likely to happen, and we take more care. And the third time, we take even more care. So we eventually learn that a flame burns every single time, and we learn to avoid it. And that is consequence. That is a consistent consequence, predictable. But in our imaginary world, that's not necessarily true. Anything can happen in our imaginary world. For example, like this. Our imagination is not governed by the rules of physics. Time. Time is another thing that ADHD people struggle with. The sense of time can either speed up or slow down. And but in the real world, time is constant and predictable. The clock always moves at the same speed. But because an ADHD person, their internal clock speeds up or slows down, their perception of time can get distorted. And so their perception of time is that it can speed up or slow down. You've heard time flies when we're having fun. So everybody can experience it to some extent, but ADHD people experience this in extreme. And of course, in the bubble, in the imaginary world, we don't even necessarily have to move with time like we do in the real world. We can go backwards in time, we can go sideways, anything can happen in our imagination. And here is a picture from Salvador Dali, who I don't know if he was ever diagnosed as dyslexic, but it wouldn't surprise me if he was, where even the clock is distorted. In the real world, we have 5 sequences. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we all know that everything that happens in time. There's a before and after everything. There can be sequence in size and amount. And if we haven't understood all these sequences, we are likely to struggle with shaping our life successfully. And the sequence of importance is another one in there. And but in the imaginary world, we don't need to follow sequence. Things can go in any sequence at all. If we think about sequence in time, for example, how a plant grows bigger and bigger over time, there are 2 sequences that go together. But in the bubble, that can go backwards or forward, sideways, any way we want. Now, order and disorder, I mentioned earlier that the problem with ADHD is that we often have unintended consequences. And it's because there is confusion about the concept of consequences, because the person has spent so much time in their imaginary world where the rules of physics don't apply. And they can also have simple confusion about what is order. Why is it okay to be drunk in the pub but not in church? And for example, there are different times, different place, there are so many variables that come into order that if you want to try, even if you have a mind that can process more information faster than the average person, if you want to try and memorize all the different rules or all the different places, it gets complete overwhelm. But if you understand the underlying principle of order and disorder, then you can see the principle at play, and you can use your understanding of that to shape your life successfully. And of course, in the bubble, you can create any kind of order you like, but in the real world, there are consistent boundaries. There are certain places where you behave in a certain way, and the boundary could be the door, or if you're tidying up, maybe the boundary is the bookshelf. That's where the books should be, and so on. So order and disorder is a key concept for ADHD people to master. And only when we mastered all these concepts can we take responsibility in our life, which is obviously a very key, important life skill. But in the bubble, there's no need for responsibility because we can always undo things and change them back however we want. But in the real world, there are lots of changes that we cannot take back or undo. So just like a cup of coffee has its place on the saucer, it has a position in that place. If you're going to use it for drinking from, it needs to be the right way up. And of course, condition, you would want it to be, for example, clean and not broken or cracked. And this is a key concept for ADHD person to master. If you think about in a classroom where they are often in disorder, they may be too loud, they may be in the wrong place and their attention may be in the wrong place, not paying attention to the teacher, they're paying attention to the butterfly that's flying past or something else. That's all a function of order. They are in disorder.
This video was produced by Gifted Dyslexic, and for further information, please visit our website www.gifteddyslexic.com. We are licensed by the Davis Dyslexia Association International, and for more information on training and interventions globally, please visit our international website www.dyslexia.com.